Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. Senator Scott Wiener represents California's 11th district, which includes San Francisco, where he had previously served as a city supervisor. In San Francisco, he authored cutting-edge laws around water recycling, solar power, and hitching public transportation and bicycle infrastructure to population growth. In the Senate, Scott continues to push the envelope on issues ranging from transportation and clean energy to food security and youth homelessness. I sat down with Senator Wiener in his San Francisco offices to discuss his childhood in New Jersey, his early leadership on LGBTQ issues, and his emergence as a new leader in the California Senate on issues that affect climate change, energy transition, and transportation. So, Senator Scott Wiener, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'd like to start by talking about your beginnings. I understand that you're from originally born in Philly, but raised in South Jersey, if I have that right. And I'd like to sort of understand how you came to focusing on public service generally, and more specifically, what sort of gave you the environmental bug.
Sure. So I come from a family that immigrated to the U.S. in the early 1900s from Eastern Europe, a Jewish family that was fleeing persecution in Russia and Eastern Europe. And I think in the Jewish community, we are inculcated with an ethic of not just public service, but understanding that if you are not engaged, if you're not paying attention to what's going on, really awful things can happen. That's been reformulated as a new saying today that if you're not at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And as Jews, we have learned that for thousands of years. And so my family, even though they were not involved in politics, people. My parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, everyone taught me from an early age that we need to know what's going on, and so that's just where we came from. I also grew up in a small town that became a larger suburb in southern New Jersey, where I was one of two Jewish kids in a class of 600. And where there was a lot of anti-Semitism. We had almost no people of color. It was just a different era, and I just was always very sensitive to how particularly minority communities are treated by the majority. So early on, I got involved interning for my congressman, and then working on some campaigns. Then I went to college, worked on more campaigns, got involved in LGBT issues, and it just went on and on from there.
So it's interesting that you experienced anti-Semitism early. I sort of had the opposite experience where I grew up in a a pretty Jewish suburb of Chicago, and was really shocked to experience it as soon as I left that suburb and went to college. How did you deal with that as a kid when you experienced it? What was your reaction?
You get used to it. When we moved into our neighborhood when I was 3 years old, it was a rural community that was becoming suburban, and some of our neighbors, this one family that lived a few doors down, when they met my parents, when they met our family, they made a comment about, well, how can you be Jewish? You don't have horns. And that was not a joke. They were just, and they were not trying to be cruel. That's just what they had always been taught. And in school, I was sometimes called a kike or other names. And when I was in 11th grade, the high school graduation that year, there was a reverend who gave the invocation, who it became extremely Christian, and this was a public school, and some of us were really unhappy about that, and we pushed back, and that was, took a lot of hate directed our way for questioning that. One time when I was in fifth grade, I had a social studies or a history textbook, and it talked about how the Jews had begged the Romans to kill Jesus. So it was a series of these things growing up, and it made me very sensitive to how people who are not in power are treated by those who are in power. And then, coming out as a gay man when I was a little older, 20, that was an additional layer of understanding firsthand what it means to be part of a community that is treated very poorly.
And what was the process of coming out to your family? Were they accepting of it or not?
Yeah, I have an amazing family. They're very liberal, open-minded people, and we have several LGBT people in the family. My aunt, my mother's sister, came out as a lesbian in the 60s. I have a cousin on my father's side who's older than I am, and she came out in the 70s. One of my mother's cousins came out as transgender. So we always had LGBT people around. So it was not out of the ordinary. And when I came out, of course, it's always awkward to tell your parents as a young person really anything about your life,
right.
Let alone something so fundamental. But they were terrific, and they've always been terrific.
So you must have been an undergraduate at this time. You went to Duke.
I did.
And what were you studying at Duke?
History and Spanish.
Okay. And what did you have a specific focus in history? I know that later on you did a Fulbright and spent time in Chile. Is that right?
I focused on Latin American history, and so studying in Chile after college, I sort of built on that research.
And sort of where did this, I guess, early sensitivity to human rights and social justice start to filter in to your thinking as a young adult?
Well, it was always there, and as I went to college and experienced more things, I became more and more sensitive to it. When I was in college in 1990. Jesse Helms, who was a U.S. Senator from North Carolina, a very notorious, horrible, racist, segregationist who kept getting reelected barely. In 1990, the mayor of Charlotte, a guy by the name of Harvey Gantt, who was African American, challenged him. And it was a hard-fought race, and Harvey Gantt was leading in every poll from beginning to end, and at the very end of the campaign, Helms ran just an overtly racist TV ad against him, and ultimately won by the skin of his teeth. And so that race taught me a lot about how much work remains in terms of eliminating prejudice and frankly bigotry. And unfortunately, with the current presidential administration, we've, the Pandora's box has yet again been reopened, and all the racism and xenophobia that we've been trying to shove into a box and bury it in the backyard and we're having some success doing that, just all got unleashed.
So help me understand how this awareness started to translate into what ultimately has become your career. I mean, were you thinking at the time that, okay, I'm gonna become a lawyer and work on these issues?
Well, in college, I thought I might want to become a history professor, and I'm glad I didn't do that. It would have been interesting in many ways, but it would not have been totally fulfilling for what I think need as a human being. And I knew that public service was something that mattered a lot to me, and I wanted to be a lawyer, but I also wanted to do other things. And so in law school, I was not really involved politically, but I became very involved in the LGBT community, doing just a lot of just straight up LGBT activism, different kinds of organizing and protesting, and working on civil rights, legal issues for the LGBT community. And that's sort of the direction I went. And then when I came out to San Francisco, I started working at a law firm for the first 5 years I was here. And immediately I decided I did not want to do politics anymore, no more campaigns, but I wanted to do community work. So I got involved in helping to build the LGBT Community Center, got involved with the LGBT Legal Association, just trying to do that kind of work. And then over time, I got drawn back into politics through sometimes happenstance, but I think at some point, it's you have to understand that if you keep getting drawn back into a certain area, that maybe you're supposed to be there.
And so what was that first, what were those first political experiences here in the city?
Well, the first one was Senator Mark Leno, who was my predecessor in the Senate. He was appointed to the Board of Supervisors about 6 months after I moved to San Francisco, and I'd gotten to know him through the LGBT Community Center. And so he immediately had to run citywide for reelection. And so I volunteered on that campaign, and then his next campaign 2 years later. And then there were some other campaigns. Once you start volunteering on campaigns, you get pulled into other campaigns. And it started building. And then in 2004, I ran for our county Democratic Committee, which in San Francisco is an extremely competitive type of election. It is not in most places, but San Francisco is a very energized political arena. And so I won that by the skin of my teeth, and ultimately became chair of the Democratic Party, and ultimately ran for the Board of Supervisors. So it was a progression for me.
So I'm curious to know when you became interested in environmental issues. And maybe we can talk about this sort of as a part two, but what the environmental community can learn from some of the success that the LGBTQ community has had in organizing. So maybe you could start with part one. At what point do you identify as sort of being the impetus or the starting point for your environmentalism?
I think it started when I was a preteen. I was 10 years old when Ronald Reagan was elected, and so I was old enough.
So was I. Were you born in the 70s? Or?
1970, yeah. And so I was old enough to know that something really bad had just happened, and I still remember that election night in our household, and I think my mother had voted for Jimmy Carter. I think my dad voted for John Anderson because he just didn't like Carter, even though my dad is super lefty. But it was like a house of mourning that this, at the time, we thought, well, this crazy person just got elected president. Little did we know that Ronald Reagan now seems like a moderate compared to the craziness we have now. But Ronald Reagan did many horrible things, but one of those horrible things was just an effort to roll back any and all environmental protections, and his Department of the Interior was trying to increase things like strip mining and other terrible anti-environmental steps. And so as a preteen, as a teenager, I became very sensitive to the need to protect the environment. And I saw firsthand that elections have consequences. And when it comes to the environment, if you win elections, you can do great things. If you lose elections, terrible things can happen. So early on, I just became very sensitive to the issue. It took a lot longer for me to really understand. I think this is true for many environmentalists, to understand that environmentalism is not just about having rules to protect clean air, clean water, and so forth, that land use, transportation patterns, that these other issues deeply impact environmental sustainability. That was a process. And I think many environmentalists have gone through that process. And frankly, and sadly, there are still people who view themselves as environmentalists because they will fight for forests and water and air, but are opposed to new housing, don't support public transportation investments, and so that's not a complete environmental agenda. That took time for my own evolution to deeply understand that.
So you spent 8 years as a supervisor.
6 years.
6 years. And talk to me about what some of your priorities were at the time, both broadly and I know that on the environmental portfolio, you spearheaded the solar roofs initiatives here, and what other sorts of issues were important to you?
Yeah, so we did a lot of aggressive work. We authored the legislation to require solar on new rooftops and to require water recycling systems in large new buildings. California is so far behind on water recycling, and we have a long-term structural water shortage. So we need to play catch up in a major way. We also, when I was on the board, we passed aggressive legislation banning plastic bags that were not reusable, and just other basic environmental building blocks. But I early on basically, I guess for lack of a better phrase, declared war on the status quo around public transportation. San Francisco and the Bay Area had been neglecting our transit systems for a long time. Transit money was routinely being diverted to other needs, and we were starting to really pay a price. And when you look at Muni and BART, Caltrain, sort of outdated systems that hadn't been properly maintained, that needed huge investment. And there was not a lot of energy coming out of City Hall for increased transit investment. And so we started really pushing aggressively, and we built a coalition of some of my colleagues and some amazing advocates in the community. And we started fighting every effort to divert transit money, and we proposed some very aggressive increases in transit funding. And we had to break glass to do that. Anything budget related is going to be a fight. It was probably the only big public fight I ever had with Mayor Ed Lee, who was an ally and a friend, was over a ballot measure that I authored to require that transit funding increase with population growth. And some people were really mad at me for doing that, but we did it and we won, and we sent a clear signal.
What was the basis for people's frustration with that?
Because it takes money
just to grab for funds.
Yeah, the money is not infinite, and when you're going to put, that was about an additional immediate $30 million a year into transit needs. It comes from somewhere. So it's always, when it comes to the budget, unless you're increasing taxes, it's a zero-sum game. So we got past it though, and fortunately, we've been in amazing budget times, so it was just fine. And the city's been able to do some really good things with those funds. And then momentum really started growing, and I was honored to represent San Francisco on the Regional Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And we, in the last 6-7 years, we passed a huge bond to rehabilitate BART. We've been able to complete the funding for electrifying and modernizing Caltrain. We're gradually replacing every single transit vehicle on all of our major systems. And over time, dramatically increasing the capacity and reliability of the systems. So we are definitely on a better track right now. We were able to get more state funding for transit last year. And we have next week a major regional transit funding measure, and we got it. We have to do it. In California, we've created these land use and transportation patterns where we get all spread out. We build sprawl further and further out because people don't want to focus more housing in existing cities, because people just don't want more development or more people around. And so you end up pushing people to drive long commutes, and they don't have access to transit. And we need to focus our growth in our existing urbanized areas and job centers, areas where people have the option to take public transportation. But then, of course, we have to match that with aggressive transit investments. And that's happening. It's happening in the Bay Area. It's happening in LA. I think I want to really tip my hat to Los Angeles, which has passed a massive transportation funding measure. They're building new rail and subway lines. They're putting their money where their mouth is.
Coming full circle to where Los Angeles started before their train system got gutted.
Gutted, yeah. It's still a challenge down there. They with the housing bill I did this year, I learned a lot about Los Angeles housing politics, and we in the Bay Area sometimes have a very arrogant attitude towards LA, and we just assume, oh, they're just Hollywood people, and they just go to the movies, and they don't really care or know anything about politics, and it's very disconnected. Well, that is false. They are as engaged and passionate as people in the Bay Area. And unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-housing activism in LA, so we're trying to work through that.
We experience a fair amount of that here. I live in Pacifica, and Pacifica is one of these sort of detached bedroom communities that is not effectively served by public transportation at all, where development is, I think, very difficult. And I want to talk about complete streets maybe in a minute, but let's focus first on some of the solar initiatives that you worked on, first here in the city and then across the state.
Yeah, so we are, the two things that we need to do in terms of decarbonizing the economy are decarbonizing our power grid, or our power system, and then changes to land use and transportation. In terms of our power system, we need to ultimately eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels and move towards 100% clean and renewable energy. And we're making progress, but there's a lot more work to do, and we need a lot more solar. And so, in my first year in the Senate, I authored a bill to take the solar rooftop mandate statewide. We weren't able to move the bill forward that year, but we also pulled back because we saw that the California Energy Commission was considering a similar proposal. So we wanted to give them space to do that, and they ultimately recently did that. It didn't go 100% as far as I would have liked, but it still goes.
What were the carve-outs that you were disappointed to see?
The Energy Commission required it up to 3 stories, and I think we had required it up to about 10 stories. Above 10 stories, you can't really do it because it's a high rise and there's a lot of equipment required on the roof. But with that said, so much of the building stock in California that's being built is up to 3 stories, so that's still a huge step forward. I also have a bill pending now, which we couldn't move forward last year. I'm hoping we can move forward this year to create a robust rebate program for energy storage systems. One of the challenges that we have in California is that we do have a growing supply of solar energy from rooftops. And so in the middle of the day, there's a huge amount of solar being generated when people aren't home. And so that feeds into the system and can sometimes create challenges in terms of so much of it being fed in. And then people come home at night and there's no sun anymore. And so we need these peaker plants, natural gas burning plants, to satisfy evening peak demand. We want to even out that curve, which we call the duck curve. And the way you do it is with energy storage systems. So you have whatever solar is being generated midday, you store it, and then you can use it later on at night. And those systems are, they're getting less expensive, but they're still expensive. And the way we can really explode that technology and make it super accessible is to grant rebates. We did that with solar panels for rooftops, and it was hugely successful. And that program ultimately expired. It did its job. We should do the same with energy storage. I also have another bill that unfortunately died this year, so we'll try it again in the future, to incentivize non-residential large rooftop and other spaces, whether it's a warehouse rooftop or a school roof or farmland that's fallow that cannot be farmed anymore, or a parking lot where you can still park cars but put solar panels above the cars. Try to really max out all of these unused spaces. But right now, there is no financial incentive for a property owner to do that, because if you're producing significantly more than your own needs, you're not getting paid very much at all.
Isn't there a PPA structure that would work in those cases?
No, I mean it would be through the net energy metering regime, which is constrained. And so, if you're a warehouse owner and you need 10% of your rooftop would be enough to provide energy for your needs, it's not worth it to you to do the other 90%. And typically a property owner would not do that. You would bring in an outside vendor to basically put a solar farm on your roof, and it only is worth it if you can get more viable rates. And so the bill that we had this year, SB 1399, would allow, say, that warehouse that has low energy needs but a lot of roof space to sell to, say, the high rise that has a ton of energy needs but has no roof space, and they could trade back and forth through the power grid, and that will create a financial incentive to max out these spaces. The investor-owned utilities don't really like that. It takes some business away from them, but we're going to keep trying because it's important.
I think it's really important. Something that always shocks me, either flying into San Francisco or into LA, is the amount of industrial rooftops that are just empty. Mm-hmm. And so I remember thinking this 15 years ago. Gosh, these should all be covered with solar, and they're still not.
Well, if you think about it, where we have some of the largest roof spaces are in the Central Valley, mm-hmm. the Inland Empire, areas where there's a lot of land, and so larger industrial warehouse kind of space gets built there. Yep. And it's a lot of sun. And so that we're going to keep working on this issue because it has huge potential.
And now, a word from our sponsor. A special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. Great. Coming back to the storage issue, was this primarily for residential storage or across the board?
It's across the board.
Where is sort of I would think that the most scale would be in commercial or even utility scale storage.
Well, we do. There is utility scale storage. It's what we call in front of the meter, so all of our large utilities have solar storage systems and are building those systems. There's a bill that Southern California Edison is sponsoring this year that will help them build more storage capacity. And my view is the answer is all of the above. I think utility scale solar and storage is important, but distributed solar and storage on people's homes, on commercial buildings where people generate their own power is also important. We need all of it.
So I want to shift a little bit and talk again about careers, but not just yours and more broadly. There are almost 5 million quote-unquote green jobs, and these range from trades, a lot of work in energy efficiency and some in solar, to policy work, to corporate sustainability, to environmental nonprofits, and so on. As you reflect on your own path that's brought you to where you are now, what opportunities do you see, I guess, particularly at first, in sort of the legislative arena, in terms of the people that are employed as staffers and organizers to work on environmental sustainability?
Yeah, well, of course, our green economy creates its own jobs in a broad sense, but in terms of doing policy work, it's sometimes challenging for people to break in. And so doing this kind of, sometimes it's just being involved in politics, working on campaigns for candidates who share these values, and then seeing if you can work for them once they get elected. There are programs like in the California legislature, we have what we call the Senate Fellows program and the Assembly Fellows program, where you can apply and you spend a year and you get paid to be basically like a junior legislative aide, and you manage bills, and it's a really great opportunity. And then for the ones that do well, they typically will get hired, maybe not in the same office, but somewhere. And so there are ways to break in. And then with advocacy organizations, those are very hard jobs to get, but sometimes you volunteer, you just, for all of these policy jobs, whether in the advocacy community or in a legislative or executive branch situation, what's important for people to know is you're not just going to most likely send in a resume and get your dream job. Right. You have to sometimes toil, means doing grunt work, whether it's, again, volunteering in a campaign or interning for free in someone's office, a nonprofit or a legislator, just getting yourself in a situation where people can notice your work, and then you take it from there. I think sometimes, and I'm going to sound really like an elderly person when I say this, but I'll say it with the younger generation. I never thought I would be saying that, but I am. I think sometimes there is a desire for immediate gratification, and sometimes it's a winding path, and you don't get what you want right away, and sometimes you have to do work that you're not thrilled about, but it's a way of getting your foot in the door. And so people need to be persistent and patient. These jobs also don't always pay fantastically, so that's another hurdle.
So what is the payoff then? Is it the meaningfulness of the work? Is it the cohort or the colleagues that you're working with?
Well, if you can get things done, that's hugely meaningful. I have my legislative aide who handles housing and transportation for me. She was in San Francisco, and when I was elected, she told me she wanted to move to Sacramento to work as a legislative aide, and she's great, so we hired her. Doesn't make very much money. Legislative aide positions in the California legislature are paid horribly. I think it's embarrassing and a travesty, but that's a whole separate issue about how we pay state employees. But she has we did a huge housing package last year in our first year, and then did this aggressive transit density bill this year, which didn't move forward, but sparked a huge conversation. So for her, she's not making an enormous amount of money, but she's gotten to be at the center of all of these huge housing debates and fights and getting some good things done. She's making incredible connections. So I hope I have her for a long time, but, people sometimes, move on in life. So she's setting herself up, both in our office and in the long run. So it's, I know it's rewarding for her. It's rewarding for me. I could be making a lot more money doing other things. But getting things done for 40 million people in California is hugely rewarding.
I learned last week that California is now the fifth, or it's steadily stepping up, the fifth largest economy as compared to nations behind Germany, I guess, which is incredible. So, thinking about some of your environmentally related legislative priorities and projecting those out into economic opportunities and job opportunities, where do you see the growth areas over the next few years?
Well, I'm hoping that construction will be one of them as we build the millions of new homes that we need. I'm hoping that workers who build and expand public transportation systems, I'm hoping that will be a big growth job area. And both of those areas, especially for unionized labor, these are good middle-class jobs where people can raise a family and have great lives. The solar and renewable energy sector, I think, will be a major growth area. I'm hoping that water recycling systems and water recycling infrastructure in general will be a significant growth area. So, I think there are a lot of areas where we're going to see growth, and the auto sector. And we don't build as many cars in California as in some other places, but we do build some, and that's going to be a growth area. And the other thing that's, I think, important to keep in mind, sometimes our opponents say, you're doing all these aggressive environmental or climate initiatives in California that, there's always trade-offs. And when you have aggressive climate rules, sometimes that can make the cost of doing business, more expensive. And they say, well, you're doing this and people, have to do these extra things and pay more. But California accounts for 1% of global carbon emissions. So look, even if we eliminated carbon emissions in California, carbon will go down by 1% worldwide. But that is not the greatest contribution that we are making. We're not going to collapse just California. We're not going to collapse world carbon emissions. What we do is we create templates that other states and other countries can take a look at. We are willing to do the aggressive pushing of the envelope, the experimentation to see what works. And then for the things that do work, and they mostly do, other states and countries can follow our lead. And so that is a huge benefit to the world economy and to the world environment.
I think the broadest example there is the decoupling of economic growth and carbon reductions, which many people thought wouldn't be possible. Last week, I was able to speak with some members of the governor's cabinet who work on these issues. And California, as you say, has really asserted itself internationally to be a leader, both on its own terms, but also to fill the vacuum that the current administration has left. And of course, San Francisco will be hosting the governor's Global Climate Action Summit.
Yeah, no, and California is proof. We always get criticized in California. It's always Texas. They're always making this big deal. Oh, California, too many regulations. You do too many worker protections, too many environmental regulations. You guys are destroying your economy, and we're going to steal all your businesses. Well, if you compare California and Texas in the last number of years, we are kicking their butts, and we have many challenges here around housing and poverty. There's no doubt about it. But the economic growth in California is just extraordinary, and it is proof that you can have a progressive, pro-environment, pro-climate mitigation strategy and still create many jobs, create a lot of wealth, grow a lot of businesses.
I want to come back to an initiative that you're working on having to do with walking and biking. This is the Complete Streets.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in terms of how people get around, a lot of people drive, and that's the way of the world, and that is what it is. We want people to use public transportation. People use ride sharing. There are a lot of different ways people get around, but people also walk and bike. And walking and biking are really important. The human body was not designed to sit still all the time. Walking is one of the best and most healthy things that a human being can do. That's if you walk a lot, that's sometimes the difference between people being thin and obese. You look at European countries where they are thinner than we are for a number of reasons, but one of them is they walk a lot more than we do. It keeps your back in shape. It keeps seniors active and healthy. And so we want people to walk. And unfortunately, in many of our suburbs, like the suburb I grew up in, you don't even have sidewalks. I grew up in a community with no sidewalks. And we're trying to move back to the way it used to be in human existence, where we lived close to each other in communities, where we were out walking in communal spaces, good public spaces, because having great public spaces overall, sidewalks are among them, but also plazas and other gathering spaces. It's just healthier for people to be outside and be around their neighbors. And then biking, of course, is it's a way for people to get around. It reduces congestion because those are people who are not in a car. They're not crowding on the buses. The bikes take up very little space. They emit zero carbon. They don't require huge amounts of space to park them. We devote so much space to parking, both on our streets and in garages. It's like a significant percentage of any city is devoted to car parking that could be used for housing or other needs. So having more people bike is terrific. And so I've done a lot of work, and we've done a lot of work as a coalition to try to say, hey, our streets should be designed for all users, not just for cars. We don't just want these incredibly wide streets. The wider the street, the faster the traffic. The faster the traffic, the more collisions we'll have and the more serious they'll be. And so having streets that are designed at a more human scale, where cars can get through and where it's designed for transit to operate effectively, designed for people to be able to bike on protected bike lanes, designed for people to be able to walk on great sidewalks and be able to cross the street safely. That's what it's about. And we've had those fights in San Francisco because people sometimes view that as anti-car, because everything needs to be designed around the needs of cars. And we're doing that work at a state level now as well.
That's fantastic. Well, I want to talk to you about that later because, again, we're having some issues with bike mobility in Pacifica, but we can talk about that separately. So just coming back to your own career, can you point to a setback or challenge that really threw you off the rails and how you responded to that?
I've had my setbacks for sure. So before I was even elected to the Board of Supervisors, I served as the chairman of the San Francisco Democratic Party, and did that for 2 years. And at the end of my 2 years, the coalition that had gotten me elected as county chair of the party 2 years before turned on me. And decided that I was, even though I was exactly the same and my politics were exactly the same, decided that I was no longer good enough. My politics weren't pure enough anymore. And it was all just a very craven, personality-driven thing. It had nothing to do with policy. It was just a political thing. And that's fine. That's politics. I don't get offended by it. So they turned on me and ran a very powerful political figure in the city against me. They thought I would back down and just step aside, and I didn't. I fought, and it was a really ugly public fought, and they ended up beating me. It was a very close vote, 18-16, but they took me out, and that was painful. But I remember the day after that happened, a member of the Board of Supervisors who I was close with called me, and he said to me, "Scott, I know this feels terrible. I know it sucks. But let me tell you, this was one of the best things that could have happened to you, because you just showed everyone that you're willing and able to fight, and you're not just going to back down." And it was right after that I started running for the Board of Supervisors. And that was one of the things that I think sort of elevated people's view of me and allowed me to win. And then more recently this year, I authored this bill to require, to allow more housing near public transportation. So to basically override some local zoning to say you have to allow apartment buildings near transit. You can't just prohibit apartment buildings by subway stations and so forth, because it's not sustainable. And the bill got a lot of attention. It sparked a long overdue discussion within the state and beyond about what do we mean when we say we want housing to be more affordable? What do we mean when we say we want transit-oriented development? We actually have to do things to get there. And it was a acrimonious debate, but a healthy one. And ultimately, I lost that bill. In its first committee, we had a vote, and I wasn't able to get a majority of the committee to support it. But we moved the ball forward, and we're going to try again next year. But it was definitely painful to go down in flames like that. But that's you just move forward. When I was a junior attorney in the city attorney's office, learning how to do jury trials, a more senior attorney said to me once, she said, "If you are not losing any trials, it means you're not trying enough cases." And so I took that to heart.
What are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? I am most proud of. I'm really proud of the LGBT community in San Francisco. This is a community that has been under so much pressure for so many years, with cost of housing, with just all sorts of challenges, homelessness. A very high percentage of our homeless population is LGBT, lots of LGBT kids on the streets. But this community, people are constantly predicting the demise of the LGBT community in San Francisco. You're just going to get pushed out. It's just not going to work. And after all this time and all these challenges, we're still here. We still have a huge LGBT community here. Young LGBT kids are still coming here, as hard as it is. LGBT seniors are finding a way to stay here. This community was almost obliterated by the HIV epidemic in the 80s and the 90s before there were any effective treatments, and the community survived. We pulled together. I wasn't here at the time, but when I say we broadly pulled together, and this community saved itself. So that makes me very proud that I'm a member of this community, that I lived in the Castro for 21 years, that I've represented our community locally and now at the state level, and it definitely makes me proud.
So you pointed to the fact that you never wanted to get into politics, but eventually were drawn in many times and ended up where you are. And we'll end on this. Why are you doing the work that you do now?
Because the stakes are really high. And when I look around and I see what's happening with the cost of housing, with the average rent for a 2-bedroom in San Francisco approaching $5,000 a month, when I see the challenges we have, not just in San Francisco, but statewide around poverty, and how many people in this wealthy state are living just in abject poverty and misery because of the cost of housing, because of other challenges. How many children are living in poverty? These are real issues. These are real human beings who are being impacted every single day, and we have to do something about it. And people sometimes say to me, you pursue these really aggressive bills, hard bills. Oh God, another Scott Wiener bill that we have to vote on. And my response is that I didn't run for office just to be in office. We have a shelf life because of term limits, and there are these problems, and you gotta be aggressive about it. So that's why I do it.
Well, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for spending an hour with us.
Thank you.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.